Hello and welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide for this AZ-500 Microsoft Azure Security Technologies. We're in the learning path for security, identity, and access, and we're now on the second module, Managing Microsoft Entra Application Access. In another recording, we talked about identities, and we talked about how identities have evolved over a period of time. And at that lesson, we talked about identities being either user principles or system principles. And so in this case, we're now going to be focusing on this new component that Microsoft Entra ID has provided for us that have not been available in the on-premises world. And when we take a look at these enterprise IDs that we have, we now take a look at especially applications and the way that the organization works. The applications need identities, and the services that you're running need identities. And in the past, we would have to create user accounts and assign them to those services, and then we had to manage them as if they were users. So one of the benefits that Entra ID provides is these modern identities, not just based on the protocols, but we're now going to be able to take things like legacy applications, modern third-party applications, as well as services across the broad spectrum of Azure, and now provide identities to those services so that they can be safe and secure and go through the same authentication and authorization process that we've relied on for users and groups that we've covered in that other recording. So the first one we want to take a look at is enterprise applications. And so as an enterprise application, I want to be able to register that application. And this could be something that you've built, or it could be a third-party application that you're working with that now allows you to register that application and have it get an identification that it can use so that when that application starts up, it's going to go to Entra ID, it's going to get its authentication of the application, and it's going to be able to use that application then to gain access to other resources through permissions and the RBAC controls that we mentioned in another recording. So applications now have the capability of having their own identity associated with them so that they can follow along our security and governance model. So when you take a look at the app registration component, and this is going to step you through how to do this, going into Microsoft Entra ID, down the left-hand side, you're going to get a blade. And so you come to the app registration, and you literally just come in and say, create a new registration. And then you assign that registration to the app. You assign it the roles. So if you're familiar with the RBAC permissions we talked about, who, what, and where, what we're completing that model is the who now becomes the application and the identity that is being managed by Microsoft Entra ID. And so that becomes the who portion. And if you remember or saw the recording, I drew these three bubbles of who, and I talked about their users and groups in that traditional model, as well as these new identities. You then assign it to a role. That becomes the what in our RBAC model. Roles become the set of permissions that are based around these roles that they've been created, and there's hundreds of them out there, and you want to make sure that you do not over-provision the application. Because remember, a user using that application potentially could have, depending on a thing called an application flow, a user could potentially inherit the permissions that were assigned to the application and then use that application to bypass security that they themselves might not be able to get to. But there are ways to get around some of that, but just be careful. And then you take a look at the access control. That becomes the where that you're going to assign that feature to, or the term we used called scope. So while you might have the role capability that offers this broad spectrum of permissions, you're only going to get them based around the scope in which you assign it. So when you take a look at the permission scopes, and you're seeing a detailed example of it here, when you get into a role, there is that assignment of who, what, and where. But if you want to go in and take a look at the granular permissions by coming into the property of the role, you'll actually get to see the list of, in some cases, there is hundreds of permissions that are assigned to them. Now, the built-in roles that are available to you are managed by Microsoft, and so from time to time, they may be added to or have features deprecated, depending on the services in Azure. You also have the capability of adding your own custom permissions. So if you have a specific requirement for security and governance, you can create a custom role and use that to be assigned as the role assignment from the app registration that you've created. Now, another set of identities that we have that came along with Microsoft Entra ID is this ID called a service principal. We've got enterprise apps, we've got app registrations, and we've now got service principals. And the service principals fall into two categories, what are referred to as system-assigned managed identities and user-assigned managed identities. So a service principal is a security principal, which is part of an identity model that you're working with. So if you remember back in the recording where we started this lesson, you'll see that hierarchical structure. So service principals are one of two types of identities that can be assigned to a whole set of services inside of Azure. And so you can assign them to a storage account. We'll give you examples as we go through this course that you can assign them to other resources, network components that they can try and gain access to something. Now, the key difference here is a service principal can be, as I said, one of two. As a system-assigned managed identity, it lives and dies together or gets managed, what the technical term is, has the same life cycle. As the system-assigned managed identity is created for this service, they manage that together, so they get used together, and if one gets deleted, the other one gets deleted as well. So if you delete the application or the service that was using it, the identity that was matched to it also gets deleted, so it doesn't create that attack surface. And if you delete the system-assigned managed identity, the application will no longer work. So it's a great way to create that ease of administration and now provide granular control to the applications or services that you're working with. So taking a look at the details here of that relationship between applications and the application that may use this. Now, you can have an application identity. Absolutely, we talked about that earlier on in this lesson. But you can now have an application that maybe you wrote that it will then go get an identity that is going to be provided to it, and it can then use that identity for things like going to Key Vault to get certificate and grant access to information. So there's a relationship between the objects of the application and the service principals and the type of service principal you're creating. So remember, on an application that has a system-assigned managed identity, there's a one-to-one relationship. They share the common life cycle. And if that application is a user-assigned managed identity, it shares that identity with potential other applications, and they don't share the same life cycle. So this way, if one of the applications or one of the services that used that user-assigned managed identity, it still is out there, it still performs and provides that identity service for the remaining applications or services, so they don't share that common life cycle. So here's the book definition that talks about the system-assigned managed identity, and you can actually create it. So you're seeing, creating a virtual machine, you can actually create the system-assigned identity that you then have when you create the resource itself. So in the generation of the resource, it builds that system-assigned managed identity for you. Looking at the user-assigned managed identity, you typically create this beforehand. It can also be created in some cases when you create this service that needs it user assigned, but then it's also available to be used by other services that as you build that service, you would assign the user assigned managed identity to it. Another feature that we have is an application proxy, and this typically goes back to those on-premises applications that you might want to extend this identity management plane to. So everything I've been talking about, we're typically inside of Azure. So specifically for the system-assigned managed identity and user-assigned managed identity, those must be cloud-hosted features. The enterprise applications that you could then register are typically running in the cloud. For an app registration, you then take an application that might be, as I said, running on premises, and what you would have to do is create an application proxy that provided that go-between between the on-premises application going through the proxy service to then use the identities that are being provided by the cloud provider, in this case, Entra ID. So there are ways for us to work with this. just know that we've got this broad range of services that you now can use and manage. Our job here is not to teach you all of the features and how to enable them, but know that for a spectrum of authentication, from a governance perspective, we could take any type of application, the legacy applications on premises, legacy applications in the cloud, modern applications in the cloud, and then services, and manage them through this various types of identities that we've shown you. So what we've now done is we've gone through and completed our identity discussion. We first started off in another recording where we covered the typical user identities that you deal with and the ways to manage them from an authentication and an authorization process. In this module and this recording, we specifically looked at the modern features of Microsoft Entra ID and its ability to handle a broader range of services and applications to now grant them very specific identities that now include them into our governance plane from an authentication and authorization source. Thank you for watching this recording. I look forward to seeing you at a future recording.